screen actually, just to describe myself. So I'm Indian looking, if that makes any sense, middle-aged man with gray black hair, which is fast losing. I wear dark black glasses. I've got blue shirt, and I'm in my office, which means that I got all sorts of things. I was trying to turn the computer, but realized all my surfaces are really bad. So I got a very bright white board on the back, and the table, and the door. And somebody was asking in the previous presentation about ethnic diversity. I suppose I'm one of your token men to do the diversity for this conference. So what I am talking about in this conference is around developing inclusive sex education, and I'm doing very much a lecturer kind of thing. So just to kind of give an idea of what the structure of the session would be, we'll look a bit around this kind of individual experiences and the complexity of it. Although this conference is mainly looking around autism and women, we'll look at other factors that might impact on an individual's experience, and then think about what are the implications of that when you're talking about sex education. My work right now is primarily with children, so I'm looking very much around educational kind of a context, but I think there probably are implications of what I'm saying wherever you are, whatever kind of setting you might be working or living in. Hopefully there'll be something useful. I'm not using any data as in numbers at all, and I'm not even presenting my research. I'm pulling from a variety of researchers to explain some of the issues, just to explain that too. So how do we know about sex and sexual understanding? How do we develop that as a human being, all of us, whether you're neurotypical or not? And what we tend to do is we got kind of multiple channels of information. Most of us probably learn a lot about sexual understanding, sexual awareness from our peers, people of our own age, and try and get some insight into that. Alternatively, your source of information might be parents. Your parents might have explained to you some things. They may have given you books and discussed things with you. Or they might be the traditional, at least in the Western world, of using sex education as part of the school curriculum, where the teachers might be explaining it to you. With the increase in technology, of course, all of us are doing this, including this conference is using a lot more of online resources. So you might be actually going online. Let's go into Google, search what it means. What does this mean? And you find vocabulary, terminology, understanding of meaning, and all of those things. Now, when we look at autistic people, some of these channels may not be as accessible for autistic people as they are for neurotypicals. So peer relationships, learning from peers, may not be as explicit or as easy for some autistic people. And parental understanding, often research around autism and parental comfort about disclosing sex education to their children, suggests that not all parents always are comfortable talking about sex to their children who are diagnosed with autism. And same issue goes with teachers, although sex relationships education is now a mandatory part of curriculum in England. That again may not be the case in all parts of the world, depending upon wherever you are sitting and listening to this from. So likelihood is a lot of autistic people actually are going towards online resources to try and discover what it means, what it is, how do I understand it, and perhaps get some peer relationships and peer exposure from that setting. So there is a problem here generally for everybody on the autistic spectrum in terms of access to clear understanding of their own sexuality and how do they actually navigate sexual relationships and just relationships in general. Because some of the research that has looked at other stakeholders, so general public, parental perceptions, even professional social workers, teachers, seems to suggest that there is still this lingering perception in some parties that autistic people are not interested in sex. They don't want to have relationships because autism means difficulties with social relationships. So why would they want to have relationships? Why would they want partners? And most autistic people are asexual. They're not interested in sex. So those kind of themes still seem to prevail in some groups, parents and professionals, which along with that goes with that some worry about actually talking about sex, especially when you're talking with children, that telling them how to masturbate, for example, might increase masturbation. So we better not tell them about that. Telling them about how to date might encourage the girl to go and date somebody else. So let's not tell them because that might lead to pregnancy and maybe she not. So all these kind of worries about, perhaps rightfully, of wanting to protect your child or young person you're engaging with would mean that people are thinking, I won't tell them because this might actually increase the sexual desire and sexual behavior. So if we don't tell them, they're none the wiser. That's all right then. We'll carry on. Yeah? So there's this attitude that research seems to suggest. But as I said, the difficulty then for somebody who's autistic and wants to understand about sex, their own understanding of sexuality, gender, and about relationships is that there's really limited source of information. There isn't published kind of easy to access information. I know Robin got this book on menstruation, and there are kind of exceptions that we got there, which are actually aimed at autistic people. That aimed at usually professionals about how do you support somebody with autism. Which could also mean, as I say, that children, young people, adults on the autistic spectrum perhaps are then going for inappropriate sources that are looking at pornography, for example, and think that might be what it is. That's how you have sex, and have wrong views about what sexual relationships should look like. Not that there's a right or wrong. I know we're talking about vast range of preferences. And even though the research and understanding and resources are developing over even my career in the field of autism, there's still very few autism-specific sex education programs or resources which are used in general schools or special schools or by other professionals. I know we had a chat again yesterday in the conference. For those of you who were here, we were there talking about gender-specific sex education program, but they are rare occurrences, hence a conference presentation is required for them. So what tends to happen is that this general sex education for neurotypicals is assumed to be applicable for autistic people, without understanding difficulties that may arise with sensory perception differences, the differences around social relationships, communication. All those factors are not considered, and we are giving this kind of basic information. So there's already an issue in terms of how sex education is delivered generally for anybody on the autistic spectrum. But then autism is not just that you have autism and nothing else. There's diversity within the field of autism. So somebody with autism could be diagnosed with other conditions, dyslexia, ADHD, intellectual disabilities, a range of other conditions. And the complexity of their experiences, which is sometimes called in the research literature as intersectionality, when there are more than one factor are collaborating, would mean that their experience might be different. Now, do I identify myself as dyslexic or autistic dyslexic? It's kind of a choice for the individual in some sense, isn't it? Similarly, there are differences in gender, and we are increasingly aware of that and looking around girls, women, and autism, as we are doing in this conference. But the factor around sex and autism and gender is kind of coming, and I'll come to more details around that in a minute. And sexual orientation, and the bit that is being picked up on is around culture, religious values, and whether you're a native of a country, whether it's Britain or anywhere else, or you're an immigrant, because that might have an impact of how you perceive your autism, how you perceive what is considered as healthy sexual relationships, and what is considered as appropriate social sexual behavior. So what happens is this complexity of identities that we are talking about. And when I'm talking about identity, I would like to mention, at least for this conference, these two specific elements of individual identity. There's your personal identity, information that you would like to share about yourselves. Something like the research passport that Robin was just mentioning right now. So what is it that you would like to disclose to somebody? Like the description I gave about myself earlier on, okay? I'm Asian looking man, middle-aged, etc., etc. And then there's the social identity, a social categorization that either has been given to me, I'm the minority ethnic person, as I'm called in the UK, or an identity that I'm actually embracing. And the personal identity and social identity may or may not be the same, because what I feel about myself may not be necessarily the information that I want to associate with in the wider context. And that's quite important to remember. The fact that I am gay, or I'm Asian, or I'm transsexual, or I'm Muslim, or those might be my personal identities, but whether I embrace it as a social identity would vary on an individual basis. And this is where, with some of the people I work with, the identity first language becomes tricky because they usually have multiple identities. As Holly said, a lot of my research looks around this intersectionality, and people have multiple identities, and their autistic identity might be their personal identity, but they may not want it as their social identity. So they don't want to be known as an autistic person. They might want to be known as an individual with autism, person first language, and choose their other identities as their social identity. I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm Christian, I'm Jew, whatever it is. That might be more important for some individuals. So that's the reason I'll be switching between individual or person first language and identity first language, because there's no right way. We are talking about range of individuals on the autistic spectrum, as Robin kept saying throughout her presentation. And a lot of research around identity first language comes from specific group, again, as we talk about it. So I'm unpicking some of those areas I said and giving you just brief examples. There isn't a lot of time for me to go into a lot of depth, but trying to give you the complexity of the situation. So other conditions, I'm just picking up as an example, intellectual disability or learning difficulty, whichever term you're familiar with, and autism. When you have those dual diagnoses, what happens then when it comes to sex and relationship education and our perceptions? Just like some research suggests about individuals with autism not having capabilities around sexual relationships, a lot of stakeholders' perception research suggests that parents and professionals often feel people with intellectual disabilities are not capable of sexual relationships. Or if they are capable of sexual relationships, that conditions apply to how far they should have a relationship. They could have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but perhaps they shouldn't have children because they purely can't be capable of looking after children when they are autistic and have intellectual disabilities. So we're judging whether somebody is able to do something or not, and not perhaps giving them that choice. And when there is literature, resources, which are aimed at people with intellectual disabilities, they tend to generally kind of obviously slow down things and explain at a different pace, assuming that it's purely intellectual disability that we are looking at. And even there's hardly any research or resources which looks at individuals who would be diagnosed with moderate or severe intellectual disabilities. What is sex education for them? How do we actually explain to them how they meet their own sexual desires and create their own sexual identity? There's hardly anything out there. And when it comes to this duality of autism and intellectual disabilities, again, hardly any information. How do you actually teach sex and relationships to somebody who's diagnosed with autism and intellectual disability? So just picking up, again, resources for intellectual disabilities may not be useful for all the reasons that we know. The uniqueness of autism that brings to this discussion is lost if we just focus on intellectual disability resources. So there's a dearth of research or resources there. Gender, as I mentioned, Robin already made a comment on this, menstruation, those kind of gender-specific puberty issues. Growing up as a girl is very different growing up as a boy. And the kind of sexual information you would need perhaps is different. I'm not going to be pregnant, so I don't need to know about what body changes happen to me, but my wife would certainly need that information. So the kind of information we need, as depending if we look in that kind of binary genders of male and female, is different. And helpfully, there is more information coming on that, which is good. But autistic adults, because there's very little research which looks around qualitative lived-in experiences of autistic adults about how they feel about their gender, autism, and sexuality. And I'm just picking up Strang et al.'s research because they did a qualitative research with autistic young people. And I felt some of the bits that they are picking up were really interesting. One of them being that some autistic young people in their research said they actually don't understand gender-related expectations. They don't consider themselves as non-binary, but they don't know how to be a man or how to be a woman. What are the expectations from me and how do I behave? And unless we provide that information, again, they may appear as if they're asexual or non-binary, which isn't personally their choice. They're saying that's not what I am, but I don't know what the gender conformities are. How do I do? So they are saying that sex education is not purely about sexual awareness and forming relationships, but that wider concept of gender identity. What does that mean to be who I am? And as the research suggests, and a lot of people have said in the conference in the last couple of days, there's an increasing percentage of autistic people who are identifying themselves as non-binary. And the percentage seems to be actually higher in females who are identified, or biologically females who are also identified as autistic by either self-diagnosis or self-identification or with a diagnosis. There seems to be a higher prevalence. So what does it mean then in terms of sex education, relationships? What does dating mean like when you're non-binary? What does sexual experience mean like when you're non-binary? We don't deal with those kind of information still. We don't actually explain those kind of information yet. And a lot of literature, research, which is looking around this gender diversity and autism, and I think generally in the field of autism for the last 20 odd years, has been that we are increasingly engaging with autistic population who can express themselves, whether it's online, whether it's a questionnaire or an interview, which means that we are missing out, again, the complexity of, for example, somebody with intellectual disabilities, autism, and non-binary. We don't know that, their experiences. Nobody is actually even considering that yet, because we're just seeing still autism and add on this one element, as if that's all it is. You're autistic and non-binary, autistic and female, but nothing else. So I've just picked up, as I say, a couple of quotations from Strang et al. Just to kind of give that insight into individual experiences. And this is a young person, and the first comment says, everybody else knows who they are and what they should like to do. And just like any other teen or child, I would like to know my identity and where I stand. But I don't know my identity. It's a bit more complicated than everybody else's. So when you are gender diverse and autistic, there's that complexity of actually understanding. And as I say, that self-identity is part of it, because unless I have that, how do I go and form relationships and understand what it means like to have a healthy relationship with somebody else? So we need to think of that element when we are working or living with somebody on the autistic spectrum who might be gender divergent. And the other young person here picks up on that kind of complexity of how autism might impact some of the process, even if you have identified yourself as non-binary or trans or any other factors. So this person says, it's difficult to plan for all the sort of details and processes of being trans, like getting appropriate treatment, changing documents, talking to people about getting accommodation, like getting the bathroom at school, is more difficult if you are on the autistic spectrum because of the executive functioning difficulties. And what this young person is saying is there's so many steps to go through to embrace the trans identity and become a trans person. And somebody has to help with that kind of executive functioning bits, which is the autism that's impacting on this individual's possibilities of a sexual identity and sexual experience. And then, quite sadly, this young person says, so when I first came out, they said something like, there's a lot of overlap between people who are on the autistic spectrum and people who are transgender. I wondered if they meant, are you sure this isn't just the autism talking? And part of the problem that this young person and some others in the recent literature are saying is that because there's so much exposure about autistic people being non-binary or being LGBTQ, is that it's almost turned out, it's one of those things that autistic people have. Are you really sure about this? Is this really your identity? And almost questioning not their autistic identity, perhaps, but their gender identity, and saying, are you sure about this? It's just not a phase. It's just not an obsession that you have. It was one of the words that one of the young people said in this word, that somebody said, it's just an autistic obsession you have. It's your recent one now. And not understanding that. And understandably, difficulties around acceptance, understanding, and not having adequate information meant that a lot of transgender females are actually saying they're having very negative sexual experiences. When they are growing up, they find it really, really difficult. They get lots of abuse, they got lots of unhappy relationships and dangerous situations that they end up in. So we almost have, if you're a teacher, social worker, anybody working with a child, or even a parent, I would say we almost have a moral obligation to teach children and young people that complexity of their personal identities and how we support them with that process. And similarly with sexual orientation, as I just said, there's increasing research which says higher prevalence of LGBTQ population. And if you look at queer literature and coming out for young people and children, there's often a huge conversation that young people talk about masking their sexual orientation, not coming out as gay or bisexual in front of their peers, in front of their colleagues, because they feel that they would be discriminated because of their sexual orientation. So there's masking that might happen because you're a female, but there might be masking that's happening because you're female and a lesbian, for example. Okay, so again, that kind of a complexities that is happening that we need to consider, that it's not one or the other. And for people who are at different ends of the autistic spectrum, if I can say that, there might also be actually fewer opportunities to explore sexual orientation. They're not really given a choice. The school curriculum might tell what it is like to have a heterosexual relationship. Homosexuality is often a very minute part in school sex and relationships curriculum. So where do they get that opportunity of actually understanding, exploring what it is that it would work? And to my knowledge, I think there are hardly any educational programs which can cover autistic and LGBTQ queries. What is sex education program like for those people? And you see this unfortunate statistic of reporting that I'm picking up all the time. Again, higher negative experiences in people who are identifying their sexual orientation as non-heterosexual. And then the unspoken thing in the world of autism until recently, which I've been banging my head for the last 20 odd years, is the whole dimension around culture and religious aspects and autism. Because sex and sexual relationships don't happen in isolation. They are contextual. They are socially happening. So what is appropriate sexual behavior? What is appropriate even personal hygiene behavior? How do you change your pads, for example? What is expected when you're going through menstruation might be culturally defined I know for sure some Indian families still have a different view about how girls should be managing their menstrual cycles compared to my white British colleagues. So there are differences in terms of social expectations for personal hygiene and about relationships. Similarly, religious factors might have different expectations. Is masturbation actually okay in God's eye or not? And if you have a firm belief in religion, and if we don't understand that and we just talk about masturbation as if it happens without any social, cultural, religious context, then we are putting these young people in a difficult situation, perhaps, or perhaps even a dangerous situation where their behavior might actually ostracize them further. And very limited research actually looked at experiences of parents and families who come from a religious or a cultural background which is different to white majority, because all research tends to generate from US and UK around autism, and what they would like in terms of their role around sex education for their child with autism. There's some research which has looked around learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities and culture and sex education. And the research that's coming from that suggests that families may differ in terms of how much they want to be involved in their sex education. For some families, it's quite important. They want to, because they want to explain to their child exactly how it happens in their culture and in their religious context. For others, it's probably not a topic you ever touch and talk about in your families. That's not what you do. And so attitudes about sexual relationships, whether you have boyfriends, girlfriends before you get married, do you have premarital sex or not? As I said, whether you are allowed to masturbate or not, all of those also might differ, and community attitudes might differ based on religious and cultural backgrounds. And Sankler and Theodore, who looked at on intellectual disabilities and minority ethnic communities, specifically in the UK, said that there are more negative attitudes in South Asian communities, for example, compared to white British families when it comes to sexual relationships for people with intellectual disabilities. And as I say, field of autism on the whole, until very recently, has on the whole just ignored the whole concept of culture and religion and its impact on individual lives and life choices. And it's just not, I suppose, autism. Sex education generally in Britain, for example, we don't consider those cultural, religious factors and how that might impact. And therefore, we have issues like families in Birmingham who are protesting about sex education a couple of years back, as you're probably all aware of if you're in Britain. And then there's this tussle of nationality and immigration history, because your personal values, if you're not somebody who belong to the same culture as a majority culture. So, for example, if you are a Jewish and you're in Israel, perhaps your cultural norms are similar to the majority norms and it might be fine. But if you're a Jew in Britain, your cultural conflicts might be, your religious views might not be necessarily what majority views as appropriate social relationships, sexual relationships, or sexual behavior. So there's this conflict that's happening as well. And there's a lot of grayness. And some of the adults on the autistic spectrum who were involved in research around cultural identity and sex say it's hard to navigate this grayness. The black and white is fine. I do this in public. I don't do this in public. When the grayness merges into it, it becomes even harder. How do I disentangle this whole phase? So what I'm talking about, what I'm trying to urge you to look at, is this multiple identities, that autistic people are not just autistic. They might have other identities that they might be more important to them at a personal level than we are assuming. So it might be that their sexual orientation, their religion, their culture, their gender, all of those might be impacting on them. And what is important, appropriate sex education for that individual might be different from another person. Just like we say, if you meet one person, autistic person, you only meet one person. And I'm kind of trying to wrap up at this kind of quotation again from Hiller et al.'s study, where a participant says, so being part of both communities, this was here, autism and LGBT, makes it difficult, because if you're just part of one community, it is easier to find a group of people who identify the same way and understand you. But if you have a multiple identity, then it's very difficult to find people who understand and accept you. And I think there's a danger sometimes that we are pushing on the autistic identity and not acknowledging the other complexities that the individual could have, which impact on their social, sexual relationships. So inclusive sex education for me is about that. It's identifying where the individual is coming and their multiple identities, and personalizing rather than prejudging what an autistic person should or should not know. So key messages, as I think you probably gathered, very little understanding of sexual relationships, sexual awareness, and understanding from diversity elements. We have very little. I mean, it's not even, research has not even started there. We're not engaged with autistic people to identify what it feels like to be those having multiple identities and what they need. So there's a gap of actual understanding before we even develop anything, kind of a developed kind of program. So if you're engaging with somebody who has this multiple identities, importance is actually understanding that individual, engaging with that individual to know what is important for them. Let's not prejudge this. You're autistic, so you must have these difficulties. You're Asian, so you must be, family might be like this. You're Hindu, so this is what happened. Let's not make those judgments. Start with the individual, engage with them, find out what is it that they want. Do they even want to have a relationship or not? And then think about how you're engaging families if you're working with children, because if there are mixed messages from what professionals are saying in a kind of an educational context to what families are saying, that again creates difficulties for some autistic young people to understand what to follow and what not to follow. So engaging and working with families becomes even more important. Right, I have gone 1 minute more. So as Robin managed to save, I've spent a minute more. So let me stop, and thanks for listening. So over to you, Holly.